The first snowflake fell on the 23rd of November, 1878, landing on Eleanor Hartley's outstretched palm as she stood on the porch of her cabin high in the Colorado Rockies. She watched it melt against her skin, a tiny death that seemed to echo the larger one she'd endured 6 months prior when a logging accident took her husband James. This would be her first winter alone in the mountains, 20 miles from the nearest town of Silver Ridge, with nothing but memories and the weight of solitude pressing down like the gray clouds above. Eleanor was 31, with auburn hair that she still braided the way James had liked it, though there was no one to see it now. Her gray eyes, once bright with laughter, had dulled with grief, and her shoulders carried a tension that hadn't been there before. The cabin James had built with his own hands felt too large and too small simultaneously. Too large for one person, too small to escape the memories that lived in every corner. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked to the woodpile, knowing she needed to bring in more before the storm hit in earnest. The almanac predicted a harsh winter, and she'd prepared as best she could: root vegetables in the cellar, preserved meat in the smokehouse, enough flour and supplies to last until spring. But she hadn't prepared for how the silence would feel when snow muffled the world, leaving her alone with nothing but the whisper of her own heartbeat. As she bent to gather logs, she heard it, the distant sound of a horse struggling through the beginning snow. Eleanor straightened, shading her eyes against the white sky. A lone rider was making his way up the mountain path, his horse's breath visible in the cold air. The rider sat hunched against the wind, clearly favoring his left side, and as he drew closer, Eleanor could see dark stains on his coat that looked suspiciously like blood. The rider managed to reach her gate before sliding sideways off his horse, landing in the fresh snow with a grunt of pain. Eleanor dropped the firewood and ran to him, her healer's instincts overriding her caution about strange men. She turned him over carefully, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with dark hair shot through with premature silver and several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were the deep blue of winter twilight. "Sorry, ma'am," he mumbled through lips already turning blue with cold. "Didn't mean to impose. Just trying to reach Silver Ridge." Eleanor saw the bullet wound then, a dark hole in his side that was still seeping blood through the makeshift bandage he'd tied around it. "You'll never make it to town in this storm," she said firmly. "Can you stand if I help you?" The man, she could see he was perhaps 40, with the lean build of someone who lived in the saddle, tried to push himself up and failed. "Name's Luke Morrison," he managed. "I'll be fine. Just need a moment." "You need a doctor, Mr. Morrison. But since I'm the closest thing to one you'll find on this mountain, you'll have to settle for me." Eleanor positioned herself under his good arm, using strength born from years of mountain living to help him to his feet. "Come on, before we both freeze." Together they stumbled toward the cabin, Luke trying not to lean too heavily on her despite his obvious pain. His horse, a beautiful black gelding with intelligent eyes, followed without being led, clearly as exhausted as his master. Eleanor got Luke inside and into James's chair by the fire. She still thought of it as James's chair, though he'd never sit in it again. Then went back for the horse, leading him to the small barn and quickly removing his saddle and giving him grain and water. When she returned to the cabin, Luke had managed to remove his coat, revealing a shirt soaked with blood. His face was pale, beaded with sweat despite the cold, but his eyes were alert, watching her with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "I need to clean and stitch that wound," Eleanor said, already gathering her medical supplies, things she'd learned to use helping James with various injuries over the years. "There's whiskey in that cabinet if you need it for the pain." "Appreciate it," Luke said, his voice stronger now that he was warming up. "Though I should tell you, the men who did this might be following me." Eleanor paused in her preparations. "Are you an outlaw, Mr. Morrison?" "No, ma'am. Former sheriff of Cripple Creek. The men who shot me are the outlaws, the Wallace gang. I was tracking them after they robbed a bank and killed 2 people. Got too close, apparently." He grimaced as he shifted position. "They think they left me for dead 5 miles back." Eleanor studied his face, saw the lines of pain and determination, the honest directness in his gaze. James had been a good judge of character, and he'd taught her to trust her instincts. "Then we'd better get you patched up before they realize their mistake," she said, returning to her task. The next hour was intense with concentration and unspoken intimacy, as Eleanor cleaned and stitched Luke's wound. He bore it stoically, only the whiteness of his knuckles as he gripped the chair arms betraying his pain. She tried not to notice the lean strength of his body, the scars that told stories of other violent encounters, the way his breath hitched when her fingers brushed his skin. "You've done this before," Luke observed when she was wrapping clean bandages around his torso. "My husband was a logger," Eleanor explained, her voice carefully neutral. Injuries were common. Luke caught the past tense. He died 6 months ago. Logging accident. She tied off the bandage and stepped back. "You need rest. The bed's through there. You can have it. I'll sleep by the fire." "I can't take your bed, Mrs. Hartley, Eleanor Hartley." "And you can and will, Mr. Morrison, because you'll heal faster lying flat, and I need you healthy enough to leave when this storm passes." The words came out harsher than she intended, a defense against the disturbing awareness she felt of this stranger in her home. Luke studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Eleanor. And it's Luke, please." She helped him to the bedroom, trying not to remember the last time she'd walked this path with a man leaning on her. James, sick, with what they thought was just a cold before the accident made it irrelevant. Luke collapsed onto the bed with a sigh of relief, and Eleanor pulled off his boots, trying to be clinical about the intimacy of the gesture. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that would soon make the mountain paths impassable. Eleanor stood at the window, watching the world turn white, and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake bringing this stranger into her home. But then she heard Luke's labored breathing from the bedroom, and knew she couldn't have done otherwise. James would have done the same, helped someone in need, regardless of the risk. She built up the fire and settled into her rocking chair with her knitting, though her hands remained idle. The clicking of knitting needles had always soothed her, but tonight the silence seemed necessary, as if she needed to hear any approach through the snow. The storm grew fiercer, wind howling around the cabin's corners, and Eleanor found herself grateful for another human presence, even a wounded stranger who might bring danger to her door. Near midnight, Luke cried out in his sleep, caught in some nightmare. Eleanor went to check on him, finding him fevered and restless. She spent the rest of the night cooling his forehead with damp cloths, giving him sips of willow bark tea when he woke, and fighting the infection that was trying to claim him. By dawn, his fever had broken, and he slept peacefully while the storm continued to rage outside. Luke woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for a moment couldn't remember where he was. Then the pain in his side reminded him, along with the sight of Eleanor moving quietly around the small kitchen area, her movements economical and graceful. Weak sunlight filtered through the windows, revealing a world transformed by snow. At least 2 feet had fallen, with drifts much higher against the cabin walls. "Storm's past," Eleanor said without turning around. She'd heard the change in his breathing. "But you're not going anywhere for at least a week, maybe 2. That wound needs time to heal, and the paths won't be passable anyway." Luke struggled to sit up, wincing at the pull on his stitches. "I can't impose on you that long." Eleanor turned then, and Luke was struck by how the morning light caught the copper in her hair, how her gray eyes held depths of sadness but also strength. "It's not an imposition if I'm the one insisting," she said. "Besides, would you rather try riding down the mountain and tear open those stitches, leaving me to explain to the authorities why there's a dead former sheriff in a snowbank on my property?" Despite his pain, Luke found himself smiling. "When you put it that way," she brought him coffee and a plate of food, helping him sit up properly with pillows behind his back. Their fingers brushed as she handed him the mug, and both pretended not to notice the spark that passed between them. "Tell me about the Wallace gang," Eleanor said, settling in a chair she'd pulled near the bed. "If they might come here, I should know what we're facing." Luke appreciated the "we," even as he worried about endangering her. 3 brothers, Tom, Dick, and Harry Wallace. Yes, those are their real names. They've been robbing and killing their way across Colorado for 2 years. I've been tracking them for 6 months, ever since they killed a friend of mine in Cripple Creek. "And you do this alone? Track killers? Usually have deputies, but the Wallace boys ambushed us 2 weeks ago, killed both my men. I should have waited for backup, but..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening with remembered anger. "But you wanted justice for your friend," Eleanor finished softly. "I understand that feeling." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional groan of the cabin under the weight of snow. Finally, Luke asked, "How long have you lived up here?" 7 years. James built this cabin our first year of marriage. He said we'd have privacy and all the beauty of God's creation right outside our door. Eleanor's voice carried a mixture of love and loss. He was right about the beauty, but I never thought about how the privacy would feel when I was alone. No family? Friends in town? My parents died when I was young. James's family never approved of me. I was a school teacher, too educated for their taste. As for town, it's a day's ride in good weather. People are kind when I go for supplies, but kindness isn't the same as companionship. Luke finished. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. Yes, exactly. I've been alone most of my adult life, Luke admitted. Had a wife once, but she couldn't handle the danger of being married to a lawman. Left me for a shopkeeper in Denver. Can't say I blame her. The wind picked up outside, sending snow swirling past the windows. Eleanor stood to add more wood to the fire, and Luke watched her move, noting the grace that spoke of hard work and capability, the straight line of her back that suggested pride despite her grief. The next days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Luke's strength returned gradually, and he insisted on helping with small tasks despite Eleanor's protests. He repaired a broken cabinet door, sharpened her knives, and told stories that made her laugh for the first time in months. Eleanor found herself looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire, where they talked about everything and nothing, books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they'd had before life shaped them into who they were. On the fourth night, Luke was well enough to join her in the main room for dinner. Eleanor had made venison stew from her preserved meat, and they ate at the small table James had crafted from local pine. The lamplight created a circle of warmth around them while snow began falling again outside. "You're a good cook," Luke said, savoring the rich stew. James used to say that, though I think he was biased. Eleanor smiled at the memory, and Luke noticed it wasn't the brittle smile of forced politeness but something softer, more genuine. "Tell me about him," Luke said gently. "If you want to." Eleanor considered, then began to speak about James, his terrible singing voice that never stopped him from singing, his ability to coax beauty from raw wood, his gentle way with animals, his dreams of children that never came to be. Luke listened without interrupting, understanding that she needed to speak these memories aloud, to give them life in the telling. He was splitting wood when the tree fell, she finished quietly. Another logger had cut it wrong, and it twisted as it came down. James pushed two men out of the way but couldn't save himself. They brought him home, but he was already gone. Luke reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "He died saving others. That's an honorable death." "I know," Eleanor whispered, "but knowing doesn't make the bed less empty or the silence less loud." They sat that way for a moment, his warm hand over hers, the touch saying what words couldn't. Then Eleanor gently pulled away, standing to clear the dishes. Luke rose to help, and they worked side by side in comfortable silence, their movements naturally synchronized as if they'd been doing this for years. Later, as Eleanor sat knitting and Luke read one of James's books, he said suddenly, "The snow's beautiful here, different from the plains." Eleanor looked up from her work. "How so?" "On the plains, snow just makes everything flat and endless. Here, it transforms things, makes the ordinary magical. Those pine trees look like they're wearing white cloaks, and the way the moonlight hits the icicles on your porch." He trailed off, seemingly embarrassed by his poetic observation. "James used to say winter was the mountain's way of making us slow down and notice things," Eleanor said softly. "I hadn't been able to see the beauty this year. Until?" Luke prompted. "Until I had someone to share it with," she admitted, then quickly returned to her knitting, her cheeks pink. That night, Eleanor was awakened by the sound of horses approaching. Her heart pounded as she crept to the window, peering out into the moonlit snow. 3 riders were slowly making their way up the path, their horses struggling through the deep drifts. She quickly moved to Luke's room, gently shaking him awake. "Riders coming," she whispered. Luke was instantly alert, reaching for his gun. "How many?" "3. The Wallace brothers." He started to get up, but Eleanor pushed him back down. "You're in no condition to fight. Stay here, stay quiet. Let me handle this." Before Luke could protest, Eleanor was moving. She pulled on her coat and boots, grabbed James's rifle from above the door, and stepped out onto the porch just as the riders reached her gate. "That's far enough," she called out, the rifle steady in her hands. "State your business." The lead rider, a big man with a cruel face partially hidden by his hat, spoke up. "Looking for a man, ma'am. Shot up pretty bad." His trail led this direction before the snow covered it. "Haven't seen anyone," Eleanor said calmly. "This storm's been keeping everyone where they belong. Mind if we look around?" the second rider asked. Already dismounting, Eleanor cocked the rifle. I mind very much. A woman alone doesn't invite strange men into her home, especially ones who ride at night like outlaws. The third man laughed unpleasantly. Outlaws? Ma'am, we're lawmen, tracking a dangerous criminal. Lawmen with no badges, riding at night in a snowstorm. Eleanor's voice was skeptical. If you're truly lawmen, you'll respect a widow's privacy and be on your way. If not, well, I'm a very good shot, and sound carries far in these mountains. One shot will bring my neighbor's men running. It was a bluff. The nearest neighbor was miles away, but the men didn't know that. They exchanged glances, clearly debating whether to risk it. Inside, Luke struggled to his feet, using the wall for support as he made his way to the window. He watched Eleanor face down 3 killers with nothing but determination and a rifle, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. We'll be watching this place, the lead rider, Tom Wallace, Luke recognized, finally said. If we find out you're hiding him, then you'll be guilty of threatening a law-abiding widow, which I'm sure the real authorities in Silver Ridge would love to hear about. Eleanor interrupted. Now get off my land before I lose my Christian patience. The men reluctantly mounted their horses and rode away, but Eleanor stayed on the porch, rifle ready, until they were out of sight. Only then did she allow herself to shake, the delayed fear making her knees weak. Luke met her at the door, pulling her inside and into his arms without thinking. Eleanor stiffened for a moment, then relaxed against him, allowing herself this moment of comfort. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen, Luke murmured into her hair. That was the most foolish thing I've ever done, Eleanor corrected, but she didn't pull away. It had been so long since she'd been held, since she'd felt the solid warmth of another person. They stood that way for several heartbeats before Eleanor became aware of the impropriety, and the warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with coming in from the cold. She stepped back, not meeting Luke's eyes. You're bleeding again, she said, noticing the red seeping through his shirt. The next hour was spent redressing his wound, both of them carefully avoiding mention of that embrace. But something had changed between them. Some barrier had fallen like snow from an overburdened branch, and they both knew it. The following days were filled with a new tension, an awareness that sparked whenever they accidentally touched or caught each other's eyes. Luke healed rapidly, driven by the need to be ready if the Wallace brothers returned. Eleanor taught him the mountain's moods, how to read the weather in the clouds, where to find water that wouldn't freeze. On the 7th night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Luke said suddenly, I should leave tomorrow. Eleanor's knitting needles stilled. Your wound isn't fully healed. Healed enough. The Wallace boys will be back, and I won't have you in danger because of me. And where will you go? The paths are still treacherous, and you don't know these mountains. I'll manage. Eleanor set down her knitting and looked at him directly. Is that really why you want to leave, or is it because of what's happening between us? Luke met her gaze, seeing in her eyes the same confusion and longing he felt. Eleanor, you're still grieving your husband. I'm a man with a dangerous job and a talent for making enemies. You deserve better than what I can offer. Eleanor stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had been her prison and sanctuary these past months. Do you know what I was thinking when that first snowflake fell? I was thinking about how I'd have to endure an entire winter of silence, of memories, of emptiness. Then you arrived, bleeding and half frozen, and suddenly the silence wasn't so loud anymore. Eleanor, she turned to face him. I love James. I'll always love him. But he's gone, and I'm still here. And for the first time in 6 months, I remember what it feels like to be alive instead of just surviving. Luke stood, crossing to her slowly, giving her time to move away. When she didn't, he reached up to cup her face, gently in his hands. You make me want things I'd given up on, he admitted. A home, someone to come back to, a reason to be careful instead of reckless. Then stay, Eleanor whispered. Not because you're hurt, not because of the storm, but because you want to. Luke kissed her then, soft and careful, a question more than a statement. Eleanor answered by wrapping her arms around his neck, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. When they finally broke apart, snow was falling again outside, heavy flakes that would trap them together for days more. The storm's getting worse, Eleanor observed, her voice unsteady. Looks like I don't have a choice about staying, Luke said, though his smile made it clear he wouldn't leave regardless of the weather. That night, they sat closer by the fire, Eleanor's head resting on Luke's shoulder as he read aloud from a book of poetry James had loved. The words took on new meaning in Luke's deep voice, and Eleanor found herself able to appreciate them without the sharp pain that usually accompanied James's memory. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Eleanor had gone to the barn to tend Luke's horse when she noticed tracks in the fresh snow. Many tracks, circling the cabin, some leading to the windows. The Wallace brothers had been there during the night, watching, waiting. She rushed back inside to find Luke already dressed and armed, having seen the tracks from the window. "They're planning something," he said grimly. "They wouldn't risk coming back unless they were sure I was here. How would they know?" Luke's expression darkened. "My horse. They'd recognize him." "I should have thought." "Stop," Eleanor interrupted. "We'll face this together. Number, I'm leaving now, leading them away. You'll be safe, once I'm gone." Eleanor grabbed his arm as he moved toward the door. "Luke Morrison, if you think I'm letting you ride into an ambush with a half-healed wound and no backup, you don't know me at all." "Eleanor, please. Number. We're going to be smart about this." Her eyes lit with determination. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles up the mountain. Abandoned for years, but solid. If we can make them think you're holed up there." Luke caught on immediately. "We could ambush the ambushers." "Exactly. But we'll need to be convincing." They worked through the morning, planning carefully. Luke would take his horse and ride toward the trapper's cabin, making sure to leave clear tracks. Eleanor would follow on foot through the trees, using paths she knew that would keep her hidden. They'd set up the cabin to look occupied, then wait for the Wallace brothers to make their move. "This is dangerous," Luke said for the 10th time as they prepared to leave. "So is doing nothing," Eleanor countered, checking James's rifle one more time. "These men threatened me and my home. James would never forgive me if I didn't defend what he built." They set out as the sun reached its zenith, the snow reflecting blindingly bright. Luke rode slowly, deliberately, making sure his trail was easy to follow. Eleanor moved like a ghost through the pines, her white shawl helping her blend with the snowy landscape. The trapper's cabin was small and weathered but sturdy. They quickly set it up to look lived in, smoke from the chimney created by a small fire that would burn out quickly. Luke's coat visible through the window, his horse tied conspicuously outside. Then they took their positions, Eleanor in the loft of the nearby storage shed with her rifle, Luke hidden behind a woodpile with clear sight lines to the cabin door. They didn't have long to wait. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, 3 figures appeared, moving cautiously through the trees. The Wallace brothers had taken the bait. Eleanor watched through her rifle scope as the men surrounded the cabin. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She'd hunted elk and deer with James. She knew how to shoot. But this was different. These were men, not game, and the stakes were life and death. Tom Wallace kicked in the cabin door, rushing inside with his gun drawn. His brothers followed, and for a moment all 3 were inside. That's when Luke made his move, stepping out from behind the woodpile. "Looking for me, boys?" he called out. The Wallaces rushed back out, guns blazing, but Luke had already taken cover. Eleanor fired, her shot catching Dick Wallace in the shoulder, spinning him around. Harry Wallace turned toward her position, raising his rifle, but Luke's shot took him down before he could fire. Tom Wallace, the eldest and meanest, dove behind a water trough, pinned down but still dangerous. "You're a dead man, Morrison," he shouted. "You and that woman both. The only one dying today is you, Tom," Luke replied, his voice cold as the mountain air. "For Jimmy Martinez and all the others you've killed." What followed was a tense standoff, Tom occasionally firing to keep them pinned while looking for an escape route. Eleanor could see him from her position, but the angle was difficult, the shot uncertain. She waited, patient as Luke had taught her to be these past days. Then Tom made his mistake. Thinking Luke was reloading, he broke from cover, running for his horse. Eleanor's shot was perfect, catching him in the leg and bringing him down. Luke was on him in seconds, disarming him and securing his hands. Dick Wallace was unconscious but alive. Harry was dead, and Tom was cursing steadily as Luke tied him to his horse. "We're taking them to Silver Ridge," Luke said to Eleanor as she climbed down from the loft. "All of them." "We?" Eleanor asked, though she was already mentally preparing for the journey. "I can't manage 3 horses and 2 prisoners alone," Luke said pragmatically, though his eyes said more. He didn't want to leave her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The journey to Silver Ridge took 2 days through the snow. They stopped overnight at a way station, where the proprietor's wife fussed over Eleanor, thrilled to have female company. The woman, Mrs. Patterson, pulled Eleanor aside while the men secured the prisoners. "That marshal of yours looks at you like you hung the moon," she said with a knowing smile. "He's not my marshal," Eleanor protested, but her blush gave her away. "Not yet, maybe," Mrs. Patterson laughed. "But mark my words, that man's not letting you go back to that mountain alone." Silver Ridge was in an uproar when they arrived with the Wallace brothers. The sheriff, a portly man named Davis, pumped Luke's hand enthusiastically while deputized men took charge of the prisoners. "The territorial governors put a bounty on these men," Sheriff Davis announced, $5,000, to be split between you and—" He looked at Eleanor uncertainly. "Mrs. Hartley," Luke supplied, "my partner in bringing them in." Eleanor started to protest that she didn't need reward money, but Luke silenced her with a look. "They'd discuss it later," his expression said. They took rooms at the hotel, separate rooms, though the proprietress's knowing look suggested she didn't expect that arrangement to last. Eleanor luxuriated in a hot bath, her first in months, and put on the one good dress she'd brought, a deep blue wool that James had always liked. When she met Luke for dinner in the hotel restaurant, his eyes widened appreciatively. He'd cleaned up as well, shaved and wearing fresh clothes he'd purchased, looking more businessman than lawman. "You're beautiful," he said simply, pulling out her chair. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Luke, people will talk. Let them," he said, settling across from her. "Eleanor, I need to say something before I lose my nerve." But before he could continue, Sheriff Davis appeared at their table. "Sorry to interrupt, but Judge Carson wants to see you both. Something about the reward, and some legal matters." They followed Davis to the courthouse, where Judge Carson, a stern man with kind eyes, waited in his chambers. "Sit. Both of you," he commanded. "Now, Morrison, I understand you're planning to continue as a marshal?" "I haven't decided," Luke said, glancing at Eleanor. "Well, I have a proposition. Silver Ridge needs a sheriff. Davis is retiring, and after your capture of the Wallace gang, you're the obvious choice. The job comes with a house, a steady salary, and considerably less travel than your current position." Luke was speechless, but Eleanor spoke up. "That's a generous offer, Judge." "It's a selfish one," Judge Carson admitted. "We need good lawmen, and Mr. Morrison has proven himself. But I understand you have a ranch in the mountains, Mrs. Hartley." "I wouldn't want to presume." "My cabin," Eleanor corrected softly. "It's just a cabin. The ranch was always more dream than reality without James." The judge nodded sympathetically. "Well, the offer stands. Mr. Morrison, you have a week to decide." As they walked back to the hotel, snow began falling again, gentle flakes that danced in the lamplight. Luke stopped suddenly, turning to face Eleanor. "I love you," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it's too soon, and you're still mourning James, but I need you to know, that job means nothing if you're not here with me." Eleanor reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cold cheek. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "James would understand. He'd want me to be happy. To live. Not just exist. Is that what I make you? Happy? You make me remember what happiness feels like," Eleanor said. "You make me want to see spring again, to plant a garden, to plan beyond tomorrow." Luke kissed her then, there on Main Street with snow falling around them and half the town probably watching from windows. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "Take the job," Eleanor said. "We'll figure out the rest." "We?" Luke asked hopefully. "Did you think I was going back to that mountain alone?" Eleanor asked. "After everything? Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get yourself shot again." Luke laughed, pulling her close. "Marry me," he said impulsively. "Right now, tonight. Judge Carson can perform the ceremony." Eleanor pulled back to look at him. "Luke Morrison, are you proposing to me in the middle of a snowstorm on Main Street?" "I'm proposing to you wherever and whenever you'll have me," he said seriously. "I've wasted too many years alone, and you've been alone too long. Why wait?" Eleanor thought about the long winter she'd dreaded, the silence that had threatened to swallow her, the weight of grief that had seemed insurmountable. Then she thought about the past 2 weeks, the laughter, the companionship, the feeling of being alive again. Luke wasn't James. and she didn't want him to be. James had been her spring and summer, gentle and nurturing. Luke was autumn and winter, passionate and protective, with depths she was only beginning to discover. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Yes, I'll marry you." Luke whooped, picking her up and spinning her around, both of them laughing as snow covered their hair and shoulders. Mrs. Patterson, watching from the hotel window, clapped her hands in delight and rushed to spread the news. Within an hour, half the town had gathered at the courthouse. Judge Carson, amused but pleased, performed the ceremony with Sheriff Davis and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses. Eleanor wore her blue dress and carried a bouquet of winter berries that Mrs. Patterson had hastily assembled. Luke couldn't stop smiling, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face as they exchanged vows. "Do you, Eleanor Hartley, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Judge Carson asked. Eleanor thought of James, felt his presence like a warm blessing, and knew he would approve. "I do," she said clearly. When Judge Carson pronounced them married, Luke kissed Eleanor with such tenderness that several women in the crowd dabbed at their eyes. The hotel restaurant stayed open late for an impromptu reception, with fiddle music and dancing that went on until midnight. As the newlyweds finally retired to their room, now singular, Eleanor stood at the window watching the snow fall. Luke came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Regrets?" he asked softly. "No," Eleanor said, leaning back against him. "James gave me 7 wonderful years. Now it's time for a different chapter." "I can't promise you an easy life," Luke warned. "Being a sheriff's wife," Eleanor turned in his arms. "I don't want easy. I had easy and safe and predictable. I want alive, Luke. I want to feel everything. Joy, fear, excitement, passion. I want to live, not just exist." Luke kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Then we'll live," he promised. "Every day, we'll live." They returned to the mountain cabin a week later to collect Eleanor's belongings and close it up for winter. Standing in the home James had built, Eleanor felt a moment of bittersweet nostalgia. Luke, understanding, gave her space to say goodbye. She walked through each room, touching familiar objects, remembering. At James's chair by the fire, she paused, running her fingers over the worn leather. "Thank you," she whispered to his memory, "for loving me, for the good years, and for making me strong enough to love again." When she emerged from the cabin with her packed belongings, Luke was building a snow memorial. Not a snowman, but a cairn of carefully placed snowballs, creating something that would last until spring. "For James," he explained. "A marker that he was here, that he mattered." Eleanor kissed him, tasting snow and promise on his lips. "You're a good man, Luke Morrison." "I try to be," he said. "For you, I want to be." They rode down the mountain together, Eleanor on the horse Luke had bought for her in town, their future spread before them like the fresh snow, unmarked, full of possibility. Behind them, the cabin stood empty but not abandoned, a testament to one love story ending and another beginning. Spring came early that year, and with it, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. Luke was over the moon, immediately becoming overprotective, trying to prevent her from doing anything more strenuous than breathing. Eleanor bore it with amused patience, understanding his fear of losing what they'd found. The town had embraced them completely. Luke proved to be an excellent sheriff, firm but fair, and Eleanor became known for her medical skills, helping the town doctor with difficult cases. Their home became a gathering place, filled with laughter and music and the smell of Eleanor's famous cinnamon bread. One evening in late summer, as Eleanor sat on their porch with her hands resting on her swollen belly, Luke came home from his rounds. He'd been up at the mountain, checking on some reported cattle rustling, and his expression was strange. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, concerned. Luke pulled something from his saddlebag, a piece of paper wrapped in oilcloth. "I stopped by the cabin. Found this tucked into the doorframe. It must have been there since spring." Eleanor unfolded the paper, recognizing James's handwriting immediately. Her heart stopped, then raced. It was dated a week before his death. "My dearest Eleanor," she read aloud, her voice shaking. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you're checking the cabin alone. I pray you never have to read these words, but I know the dangers of my work, and I need you to know some things. First, you are stronger than you believe. You will survive without me, though I hope you won't have to. Second, the loose board in the barn's third stall hides our savings, enough to see you through several winters if needed. But most importantly, my love, I want you to know that if I'm gone, you have my blessing to love again. Don't waste your life mourning me. Find someone who makes you laugh, who sees your strength, who loves you as fiercely as I do. Be happy, Eleanor. That's my final wish and my eternal prayer for you. All my love, James. Eleanor was crying by the time she finished reading, and Luke pulled her into his arms. He knew, she whispered. Somehow, he knew. He loved you enough to want your happiness even after he was gone, Luke said softly. That's real love. Eleanor looked up at him through her tears. You would do the same, wouldn't you? In a heartbeat, Luke confirmed. But I'm planning on living to be 90, just to spite anyone who tries to make you a widow again. Eleanor laughed through her tears, and at that moment, the baby kicked strongly. Luke's eyes widened as he felt it through Eleanor's belly. He's saying hello, Eleanor said. She, Luke corrected with a grin. Definitely a she, with that much spirit. The first snow of the new winter came on the day Eleanor gave birth. As the flakes began to fall outside the bedroom window, she brought their son into the world. Yes, a son, despite Luke's predictions. They named him James Lucas Morrison, honoring both the past and the present. As Eleanor held her newborn son, with Luke beside her and snow gently falling outside, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had stood on her porch, dreading winter and the isolation it would bring. She had caught that first snowflake in her palm and watched it melt, seeing in it a symbol of everything ephemeral and lost. Now, watching the snow through different windows, in a different home, with a different man's arm around her, she saw the snow differently. Each flake was unique, beautiful, temporary but part of something larger, a blanket that covered the earth, protecting it until spring could come again. What are you thinking? Luke asked, kissing the top of her head as baby James nursed contentedly. About snow, Eleanor said. About how it can be a prison or a blessing depending on who you're with when it falls. Luke was quiet for a moment, understanding. Then he said, Tell me about that first snowfall, the one you were facing alone. Eleanor thought back to that November day that seemed a lifetime ago. I was so afraid, she admitted. Not of the snow itself, but of what it represented. Months of solitude, of silence, of memories with no one to share them with or help me create new ones. And then, I showed up, bleeding all over your clean floor, Luke said with a wry smile. And then you showed up, Eleanor agreed, turning my ordered grief into beautiful chaos. They watched their son sleep, his tiny fingers curled into fists, his dark hair, like his father's, still damp from birth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, their home was warm and filled with love. 5 years later, on another snowy November day, the Morrison family, now including James, his sister Sarah, and baby Thomas, made their annual pilgrimage to the mountain cabin. Luke had bought it from Eleanor, and they used it as a summer retreat, but this trip was special. They built 2 snow memorials this time, one for James Hartley, one for the loneliness that had once threatened to consume Eleanor. The children, too young to understand the full significance, helped pack the snow, while Eleanor told them stories about the man their brother was named for, and the courage it takes to love again after loss. That evening, as they sat around the fire in the cabin, Sarah asked, Mama, why do you cry when it snows sometimes? Eleanor pulled her daughter close, looking at Luke over the child's head. Because snow reminds me of many things, sweetheart. Sad things and happy things all mixed together. Like what? James asked, ever curious at 5 years old. Like the day I met your father, Eleanor said, smiling at the memory. He came riding through the snow, hurt and needing help, and changed my life forever. Tell us the story, the children chorused, though they'd heard it many times. So Eleanor told them about the widow and the cowboy, the snowstorm and the outlaws, the fear and the love that grew from shared danger and shared laughter. She told them about choosing to live instead of just survive, about the courage it takes to open your heart after it's been broken. Luke added his own details. How beautiful their mother had looked, defending her home with a rifle. How brave she'd been facing down the Wallace brothers. How the snow had seemed to sparkle around her when she'd said yes to his proposal on Main Street. By the time the story was finished, the younger children were asleep. James, fighting to stay awake, murmured, Snow brought you together? Yes, Eleanor said softly, tucking a blanket around him. Snow brought us together. Later, after the children were all in bed, Luke and Eleanor stood on the porch where she had stood that long-ago November day. The snow fell softly, each flake catching the moonlight before settling on the ground. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come?" Luke asked. Eleanor considered. "I would have survived," she said honestly. "I would have made it through the winter and many more. But surviving isn't living, Luke. You taught me the difference." Luke pulled her close, and they stood together watching the snow transform the familiar landscape into something magical and new. In the distance, a wolf howled, lonely and wild. But Eleanor felt no fear, no kinship with that solitary cry. She had found her pack, her place, her purpose. "I love you," Luke said, words he still spoke every day, as if afraid she might forget. "I love you too," Eleanor replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The snow continued to fall, covering their footprints from earlier, erasing the paths they'd walked to get here. But Eleanor didn't need those old paths anymore. She had new ones to forge, with Luke and their children, through winters that no longer threatened but promised. Promised beauty, promised peace, promised mornings waking up to white-covered wonders and a warm hand reaching for hers. As they went inside, Eleanor caught one last snowflake on her palm, watching it melt as that first one had so many years ago. But this time, she smiled. Some things were meant to be temporary, she understood now. They made room for new things, better things, unexpected blessings that arrived in storms and changed everything. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold but not the beauty of the snow. Inside, their fire burned bright, their children slept safe, and their love, tested by grief, strengthened by adversity, and sealed by choice, continued to grow, as steady and certain as winter's promise of spring. In Silver Ridge, people still told the story of the widow and the sheriff, how a snowstorm brought them together and how they brought warmth to the coldest season. It became a legend of sorts, told to young couples and lonely hearts alike, that sometimes love comes not in spring's gentle bloom but in winter's harsh beauty, carried on snowflakes and sealed with courage. And every winter, when the first snow began to fall, Eleanor Morrison would step onto her porch, catch a flake in her palm, and whisper a prayer of gratitude. For James, who had loved her first, for Luke, who had loved her back to life, and for the snow that had brought them together, transforming cold flakes into the warmest memories a heart could hold.